Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Wiley. I'm the Student Services Coordinator at Yes Tomorrow Design Build School and the host of our Spring Speaker Series. I'm really excited to come to you all from what is currently a snowy Vermont in late April to welcome our speakers for the evening. Before we get started, I want to give a little bit of an orientation to how to interact. As it's a webinar format and a live stream on Facebook, it's not possible to lend your voice easily to the conversation. But if you're in Zoom, you can use the Q&A box. You can use the chat to discuss amongst yourself or ask questions. It's a little easier if the questions you want to ask the presenters is only in the Q&A box, but either one works. I'll do my best to monitor them both. If you're on Facebook and you have questions, you can just go ahead and ask those in the comments on the video as it's streaming. So for those of you who haven't participated or watched one of these before, this program, the speaker series, has been going on for quite a long time, but we revamped it in the last couple of years. And then last spring with COVID, we switched it to an online format. It's traditionally been a free event as an offering to the extended Yes Tomorrow community, just to shine light on awesome things happening in the design build world. And one of the things I love most about it, switching to an online format, is that we can have guests from all over the country. We can access more people more easily instead of saying, hey, do you want to come travel all the way to Vermont to give a presentation? So it feels nice to have a little bit more access to people. So let's see, I think that's the basic intro. I'm in Vermont in Yes Tomorrow, where we're on Abenaki territory. In the chat and the both on the Zoom and on Facebook, we're going to put a link to our Indigenous land acknowledgement and diversity, equity, and inclusion statements on the Yes Tomorrow website. Feel free to take a look at those to see what we're up to in that work. Our two guests, Blain Snipstal and Dom Hosack, are coming to us from Brandywine, Maryland on, they are on, pardon me, Piscataway territory. So that's where they're coming from, and we're so excited to have them here. They are two folks involved with Earthbound Building, and they're going to talk about how they got to be who they are, what they're doing, and where they're going. I'm really excited about it. So Blain is the founder, designer, and lead builder for Earthbound Building. Blain has a long history in farming and land-based organizing, both domestic and internationally. Blain is a dedicated craftsman and a member of the Timber Framers Guild. And Dom is a builder and cooperative development lead with Earthbound Building. He's also a cooperative finance fellow with the Climate Justice Alliance and is passionate about supporting the solidarity economy. So without further ado, I will pass it off to you two.
Oh, all right, unmute, thanks. Sweet, Dom, you want to start us off? I'll get the screen share going.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody, and thank you all for joining our nice little chat this, I guess, evening for us, depending on where you are in the country. I'm one of the members of Earthbound Building, and as Rachel had mentioned, we're a worker-owned construction cooperative. You're going to learn a whole bunch about the work that we do, why we're a co-op, and how we are using those principles of cooperation and community to build power. And so I will, you can pass it over to the next slide. We can kind of dive in. So I'll say just a little bit more about myself. Thank you, Rachel. I am a worker owner with Earthbound. I've been with Earthbound Building since 2016. I had met Blain. Blain's a farmer. He'll talk a little bit more about himself. But I'd met Blain through sort of farming circles in Maryland. I had been really interested in urban farming at the time, and there was a workshop that he was hosting and a group of folks that he works with. And we had connected there. I expressed interest to him around learning how to just do the basic like learned the basics of carpentry and construction, and we've been rocking together ever since. Kind of took off from there. I also do a lot of work with cooperatives. I'm a finance fellow with the Climate Justice Alliance, and so that looks like supporting early stage cooperatives get access to financing, and cooperatives in the growth stage kind of working through and troubleshooting and providing technical assistance. I've been really interested in co-ops for some years now. There's a really deep history of cooperative work in Black and Brown communities, and so leaning on a lot of that history has brought me to this point now. And yeah, really excited to be here and to share with folks.
Sweet, thanks, Dom. Yeah, so as Dom kind of alluded to, I actually come from an agricultural background. I started farming in my late teens, and that's more or less how I spent the last, well, I guess up until 2016, 10 years as a small scale organic farmer. And, you know, part of being a farmer is you got to do a lot of different things, wear a lot of different hats. And my family also happens to be in construction. And so I always had a knack for just putting things together. You know, so through the farming life, I had the opportunity to essentially travel around the world because of farming. And on those travels, many observations were made, but two that are particularly important for tonight's conversation was that sustainable agriculture and natural farming have a fundamental interconnection. And in addition to that, typically where you see sustainable agriculture and natural building, you also see collections and cooperatives of groups of people working together. They seem to be very mutually inclusive around the world and historically here in the US. And so that sort of brings us to how we started, you know, farms, farmers, and infrastructure. It was really Earthbound grew out of that core observation that sustainable agriculture is the model of agriculture that we need to feed the world and to feed this society and to address climate change within the context of ag. But in order for small scale farms to be viable, they need many things, but in particular, they need infrastructure. And that infrastructure should reflect the sustainability metrics that their farms are implementing. And so that was sort of at the core of why we started and sort of how we started. Initially, you know, we started as a co-op of one, which was me. Because of this farming sort of ethos and network that I came out of, we were very connected to many different farmers who then eventually became part of Earthbound Building. And so oftentimes we'll really just, even though we're builders, we describe ourselves as farmers that build. And that really lends us to the clientele we work with, because we can look at their farm or look at their project and see it from both the lens that they're looking at and then also from our perspective as builders. And Don will go into this in greater detail on the next couple of slides, but just to give you a brief snapshot of who we are, we're currently 5 members and there's 2 worker owners. And so you can be a member in our structure, you can be a member of our co-op, but you don't necessarily have to be a worker owner, even though we have a pipeline and incentive set up for people to become worker owners. And we're African-American owned and operated. We don't shy away from that. We find that we are, you know, few and far in between in the trades in general, definitely within the context of timber framing and natural building. And we want to provide an image to other folks of color to show them that it's possible, that the field doesn't have to be dominated by any one particular group, that there's space for all of us, and that in fact, there's actually a legacy of folks of color and Black folks who have been in the trades and contributed greatly to certain parts of the trade over the development of those trades in this country. You know, citing the farming tradition that we came from, we also grew out of a group called the BlackDirkFarm Collective, which is a group of a handful of farmers, activists, educators, who do a bunch of political education and training for folks of color, migrant folks, farm workers around sustainable agriculture, popular education, revalorizing our connection to the land. And so Earthbound kind of growing out of that context, that's still at the core of sort of our internal value structure. And so, we're, as much as we are a small business operating in the context of our economy and generating profit, equally to that, do we really center the values and sort of political ideas of the world that we want to live in, and thus what we want to reflect. And so a big piece to our business, sewed into it throughout, is political education and social transformation, is this idea that we're constantly evolving, and that what we do and what we produce should be products of our evolution and should also inform our growth as people. And so this idea that we're constantly transforming, and hopefully that our process allows us to ultimately become kind people, better people, people who are more in tune with nature and with each other. Another core value for us is going through together. This is a traditional African-American concept that comes out of the Black Belt South. And it's this idea that we don't know, we have an idea of our finish line, where we want to get to, but we don't necessarily know exactly how we want to get there. But we do know that we want to get there together, and we're willing to make it possible that we can do that. And that's more or less called going through together. And so traditionally in the South, that meant that you had, very similar to what people might consider as part of the Amish community today, you had barn building parties, you had harvest parties, you had planting parties, you had childcare mutual aid co-ops, you had all these different facets to that fabric of society at time. And going through together sort of encapsulates all of that. And that was passed down to us from some of our elders. And then another core value, if you will, concept is this idea of a dignified economy. That the economy as it's structured today at a macro level is not a dignified economy. In fact, it's a highly exploitative economy. And so we want to feel dignified in our workplace and in the work that we're doing. And we want our work to reflect that. And so if you were to break it down into a sentence, for us, a dignified economy is simply the capacity to contribute economically with respect and without exploitation, domination, and violence. And we'll kind of break this apart as we go throughout the presentation tonight, but I really can't underscore how important that is to us, and that's why we wanted to offer that up in the conversation tonight, because every aspect of our society, and definitely in the construction industry, is based upon some form of exploitation, domination, or violence. And so it's a really critical thing to acknowledge. How do we contribute to the antithesis of that, which is a process of peace and anti-violence? Okay, and what do? And we actually build things. We don't just have words on paper. I don't know, Dom, if you want to take this part.
Yeah. No, and thank you for that context, Blain. And so a lot of the things that he was talking about, we've really incorporated into the work that we do. And so those principles of ecology, of craft and dignity, and of cooperative economics, we bring that into also the actual work that we do. So we specialize in timber framing, custom carpentry, natural building, and really any sort of outbuilding and agricultural infrastructure that serves the needs of our farming and rural communities. We have a criteria for how and why we work with folks, trying to keep the base that we started with, keep that base served, and stay true to the mission that we have as we're growing and starting to get bids and questions from all over the place. We're trying to really stay focused and serve the needs of those that we started with. And offer really functional and also aesthetic value for the farmers that we work with and landowners that we work with.
Yep. And so these are just some pictures of, and I must say we're terrible picture takers. It's always like an afterthought. So bear with us here, but this just gives you a glimpse of some of the stuff. And this middle one here is we do a fair amount of historic preservation and timber frame barns, a lot of bank barns in Northern Maryland that we get called to do assessments and some repairs, some extensive repairs. We actually started out doing high tones. That's actually the first thing we started doing. If you asked us to do that now, we would run the opposite direction because we've done over, I can't even, hundreds at this point. And we really try to support farmers to do them on their own. And yeah, so these are other odds and ends, a barn, a timber frame in North Carolina, and then helping out a friend who has a worm composting business and wanted to do like this modern facade thing going on.
Sweet. Awesome. So I think before we dive deeper into the actual work that we do, it's important to just like frame ourselves around, what our business entity, you're going to hear the word cooperative a whole bunch tonight. So what that actually is, why we specifically Earthbound chose to form ourselves as a cooperative, and what that really means. So as Blaine had mentioned, Earthbound started actually just a single member LLC. And the crew, myself, some other folks, we just kind of jump on jobs as needed. But after several years of working together, and again, that concept of going through together, but really learning how, not just working together, but learning how to work together, how to overcome issues together, how to work through conflicts, how to communicate together, which is like such a huge process in and of itself. We all decided that formalizing as a cooperative made the most sense. We have this really healthy working relationship. There's a desire for folks to not just take on more responsibility in the business, but also have more equity and more share in the profits that we're all generating together. And so the idea came to like, let's kind of formalize ourselves and organize ourselves in that way. And so I think, really quickly, I'm sure a lot of folks on this call know what cooperatives are, but I think just to kind of start us there and share some of the basics about cooperatives. So I think the first thing I always like to point out is that, a cooperative is not too dissimilar from any other small business, right? Like the basic business principles, having low overhead, understanding your margins, understanding the scope of work that you're getting into, and ultimately being able to, be financially viable is all a part of being a cooperative. It's no different than any other small business. So I think there's some kind of fluff sometimes when you hear the word cooperative, and it's like really feel good. But really from a market standpoint, a co-op and a small business, it's really the same, right? But where co-ops really differ is in the practice of actually running the business. And so I think to ground ourselves first, there's sort of 7 universal kind of principles of cooperation. And these principles together, if observed inside of an enterprise, this is what kind of designates it as being a cooperative. So cooperatives are voluntary organizations. We're not mandating anybody to work with us. We're not forcing folks to work. And we, the voluntary part is really important. This isn't something that's supposed to be belaboring to people or something that's stressful to folks. Obviously work can be tough, but being a part of Earthbound is something that we want everybody to want. This is something that we want you to come in with the excitement and the eagerness to do this work. And it's really, really important. And on our side, we're able to share and accept without any discrimination around gender, social issues, racial issues, political issues, religious issues. Those are all things that we're not discriminating around those things, right? So that's kind of basic, like most businesses. So here's where things start to change a little bit. We have democratic governance. So everybody that is involved with Earthbound and the way Earthbound operates is through consensus-based decision-making, which can be terribly, terribly challenging, trying to get a bunch of people with a whole bunch of different backgrounds to agree on certain things. And so this is sort of that process of going through together that takes time. The transition from being just a single member LLC to what we are now is almost a 3-year period. And during that time is when we really learned how we could be democratic together, how we can share responsibilities together, and how we can come up with this consensus-based decision-making. And I will say for certain things, it's not always consensus. Some things, high-level capital asset purchases, bringing on new actually worker owners, some of the financial and legal decisions of the cooperative, Those are held with the worker owners, and we'll share that information out during meetings and retreats, but not trying to bottleneck things too much with folks that might not have as much experience with that. But any of the day-to-day operational or logistical things, when we're getting to jobs, how we're organizing and managing the work around jobs, what sort of jobs we're taking on, why folks are paid a certain wage, all of that is shared openly, and there's a consensus base around all the decisions that are made in that way. There's an economic participation that's involved with being in Earthbound. So some co-ops, it looks like, yeah, you're paying in to become a member. In our case, we not only just value dollars, but we also really value the sweat equity that goes into working with Earthbound. And so when you're looking at sort of the pathways to ownership, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, the amount of jobs, the amount of time you've been with Earthbound, and the revenue that you've supported Earthbound generating is all factored in when looking at your equity stake to actually become a worker owner. So there is an economic participation that's involved from everyone, but it can look a whole bunch of different ways. And we, again, highly value sweat equity. Autonomy and independence. I mean, that's sort of the core of why we became a cooperative, and what the cooperative movement is about is communities being able to control, make decisions, and have the autonomy and the space to do that. And so we're really, really proud of being a standalone entity. We're not supported by any, nonprofit or any, large fiscal sponsor or large financial backer. We stand alone, and the work that we do speaks for the members that are a part of our cooperative. Education, training, and information. So this is a huge, huge part of the cooperative movement in general, but also Earthbound Building. We provide education and training for all of our members. It's not, I wouldn't say mandated, but strongly encouraged to go to timber frame workshops, for example, take carpentry courses, take a low impact forestry course in Maine. We understand that any information and education that folks take in individually will broadly help our cooperative and push us all forward. And so that is one really key piece to being a part of Earthbound. And from the first day that you join the cooperative, even as a builder at large, which I'll talk about what that means, you're pushed to go to workshops, go to trainings, and increase the skills that you have to, again, increase the capacity of the cooperative. Cooperation among cooperatives, another really important component of the work that we do in the larger cooperative movement. We're a part of several different cooperative organizations. We're a member of the Federation for Worker Cooperatives. As I had mentioned before, we are a member of the Climate Justice Alliance and also the BlackDirkFarm Collective, all of which are sort of cooperative organizations that are doing that are playing different roles in the space of sort of social justice, economic empowerment. And so we are in deep solidarity with these groups. We've done builds actually for some of these groups. We'll do trainings, finance trainings, and technical assistance trainings for other early stage cooperatives. And so that's sort of a big part of the work that we do also. You'll find Blain and I, more than I'd like, but on calls in the evenings, with other cooperatives, helping them troubleshoot some of the basic issues of payroll and any of the basic kind of business issues that we stumbled through in the beginning, and now we're able to help folks along in that way. And so that's something that we're really proud of. And then lastly, just concern for community. You'll hear a lot tonight about taking away the bad and bringing in the new, or bringing in the good, excuse me. But Earthbound is set up to be an economic engine for our community, provide dignified, well-paying jobs, and really listen to the needs of folks that are in our community that are looking for potentially like affordable housing or infrastructure for their farms. And so there's a really deep listening component of Earthbound Building and a concern for community that we carry with us in the work that we do. And so, as I had mentioned, there's several pathways.
Yeah.
Before we move on to the next section, I have a couple questions that came in. One I think you touched on a little bit, but someone was wondering, can you start a business as a single person cooperative with the expectation for more growth, or does it start as an LLC and then eventually transition into a cooperative or just the structure?
Yeah, I think that most often it starts as sort of one person, as a single member LLC, or like, yeah, just one owner who, through either like direct political education from some of these groups that are trying to encourage more co-ops, or like Blain, sort of their own lived experience, realizing like, hey, it might be valuable to bring on some more minds into this business to kind of take it further. So I think that I think conversions are a big thing that you're seeing a lot of now, where again, like successful small businesses who have, a really good core of workers and one owner, the owner's kind of relinquishing some of this control to the workers and democratizing the workplace in that way. But yeah, I also do think there are some folks who are starting businesses with the intention of it eventually becoming a cooperative, and they're just like looking for the folks to make that happen, which is the hardest thing to do. I think it's much easier to be a successful business and have good working relationships and then convert to a co-op than to try to start a co-op yourself and find the people and the right pieces, because the people part is what's really, really challenging on top of just running a small business.
Cool. Thank you. There was one other question that came in from Scosh. Are member owner shares held equally?
They are. They are held equally. Yep. And that's why, and I'll talk about this next, but there's a long process from when you first start in the cooperative till you can actually be an owner. And there's a whole bunch of criteria that are involved with that to make sure that once that transition happens, it's a good fit. And we're minimizing the risk. I mean, there's always obviously risk of sharing, equity with a bunch of people, but minimizing the risks by going through this long process of understanding you as a person and how we work together and how we all relate as a group. So that's a great question. And yeah, it leads leads really well into the next session, section, pathways to ownership. So as I had mentioned, anyone that starts with Earthbound, much like any conventional business, there's sort of like a 90-day trial period. Your wage is a little bit lower than it would be once your 90-day period is over. And that's just us getting a sense, kind of first and foremost, of like the things that you had on your resume in terms of like your carpentry experience and such. Does that match with what we're seeing on the job site? On the most broad level, does your personality seem to fit with what Earthbound does? And is your work ethic and your ability to work at the sort of level that we're looking for and can match the kind of the work that we do? And after that 90-day period, then this is when your 2-year candidacy period starts. So anybody that is interested and says to us after the 90 days, because we spend a lot of time explaining to new members and new folks who are engaging with Earthbound, like what we are and what we do, and explaining these like kind of pathways to ownership and pathways to a higher wage. We give folks a 2-year candidacy period. So, okay, you're interested in joining the cooperative and being a part of this. There's going to be a 2-year period until you can actually become a worker owner. And that time period is really important because, as folks who own businesses know, getting into a business relationship is not too dissimilar than getting into a marriage. And you really want to be thoughtful and discerning about the partners that you have. And I wouldn't recommend anybody to get married any shorter than at least a year in. And we've decided to push it to 2 just to make absolutely certain that you've seen all sides of this person. Blain's a different person when he's angry. And I've seen that, and it's okay, and I can deal with it. So you don't get to see all of that until you really, really get to know a person. So we have this 2-year candidacy period. And it's not just the length of time, the duration, but it's also having the required skills training, like I mentioned. So folks that are in that candidacy period, it's no longer like, oh, we're suggesting you go to a workshop, but it's like, yeah, we are all going to workshops, and it's really important for you to bring those skills back to the co-op. So that's something you need to be doing. And also other professional development skills, right? Because so much of the business, unfortunately, I do our finances, what I'm realizing is almost 50-50 is like, yeah, I'd love to be out cutting all the time, but there's so much back-end admin that needs to be done also. So we really want folks to have some of those soft skills also, so we can distribute the workload amongst us. And as I mentioned, having voluntary admin duties, somebody that can eventually help pick up payroll, somebody that can help with material takeoff, somebody that, can help talk to suppliers. So like, it's not just showing up, doing the work and then going home, but to become a worker owner, there's also a process of, seeing sort of how the engine runs and how the sausage is made, I guess is a saying that folks say, but like really understanding the ins and outs of Earthbound and like plugging in meaningful ways. So yeah, that's my little piece on the cooperative side of Earthbound.
Yeah, and the only thing I would just add is, like, it says voluntary administrative duties. It doesn't mean that people are volunteering. People are still getting paid for that administrative. But we've set it up to where that folks can self-identify what those administrative duties are that they either A, already have capacity or experience in, or B, want to grow in, and the co-op supports them in growing in that way. This is gonna click.
I had another question come in that you may want to answer now, may want to answer later, but John was wondering, how did you guys find each other? What's your origin story? I know you mentioned it a little at the beginning, and if you want to save it for later, that's cool too.
No, we can, yeah, so yeah, I kind of mentioned it a little bit. I was in school, I was studying like urban ag and food sovereignty and food justice, and went to a workshop at an urban farm that I've ended up working at for a while, over what's called agroecology, but what this workshop was afroecology. It was like specifically for Black and brown folks and orienting them around food and food justice and land. And Blain was one of the facilitators. And we hit it off at the workshop, got to talk a little bit briefly. And then I called him. I had gotten his number and called him, and we talked on the phone for like damn near an hour, just kind of shooting the breeze, and first about the job, but then just about life and shooting the breeze. And I think that following week, I was on my first job with him, building a high tunnel, this grueling like 30-foot wide by 96-foot long high tunnel that you have to pound the posts in like with a sledgehammer, these metal posts. And it was just like this awful job, but we worked together really well. And yeah, it's kind of took off from there. I think a year, maybe 2 years later, he moved really near me, down in Brandywine. I just moved down here and had a child, and then Blain moved down. And yeah, it really started sort of the deep process of like working together, but also like really building a friendship, and then also like a business marriage also, which is another layer on top of that. And so, yeah, Blain, I don't know if I missed anything.
No, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I can dive into just really quickly this next slide. We won't spend a whole bunch of time on it. But for folks that might be familiar with the concept of just transition, so there's a lot of organizations, kind of movement-based organizations out there, that are talking about how we can transform the world we're living in now, which is a world that's really predicated on extraction, right? The extraction of natural resources from the earth, the extraction of labor and brain power from people, the the extraction of our social and cultural interactions with each other, how we can change that, through a filter of value. So much like we talked about a filter of ecology, a filter of cooperation, into building this new and regenerative world that we'd like to live in. And a lot of it starts with divesting from that extractive economy that I was talking about. So you folks have probably heard about some of the divestment movement and the campaigns around, pulling out money from organizations that are investing in fossil fuels, for example, or investing in the military industrial complex, or investing in, Wells Fargo and other like horribly extractive banks, and moving that money to organizations and small businesses that are doing positive and helpful work, and meaningful work. And so, a really great example of that is there's an organization called the Seed Commons. They provide financing, loans and grants financing to cooperatives. They take in money from the divestment campaigns and then are able to loan at really low interest to cooperatives. So Earthbound was able to finance our first pieces of capital assets through this loan fund, and then now our land purchase that we recently went through this loan fund. So it's a good example of money that was divested again out of these sort of toxic economies that are out there that we live in and within, and moving that to businesses and an economy that's more regenerative. So that's sort of a like broad top layer. Just transition is a whole framework with like a deep theoretical backing behind it. And I don't think I have enough time in the next 25 minutes to dive into all of that. But that's just a quick snapshot of sort of the framework that we are using and the lens that we're using as we're moving through the work.
Yeah, and no, thanks for that, Dom. And right, so then the question then becomes, all right, as builders, as persons who are part of the construction industry, where are we now? Where do we want to be? Where do we sit in the spectrum? And the reality is that it's a mix of both, and unfortunately, it's predominantly part of the extractive economy, right? In terms of the broader conventional construction industry. Figure out my computer is click. Okay. And so understanding all of this, we call it, framing the context. In this case, framing the bad. And for us, in preparing this presentation and just like how we think about ourselves in the context of this, we think about it really in like three critical pieces. That human-driven climate change is real, and it's happening, and it's accelerating. Climate change is something that happens on Earth, but this stage of it, this anthropocentric form, is unlike any other form of climate change outside of asteroids entering or volcanoes erupting, right? And so that's one thing to acknowledge and think about, okay, what's our place in that context as builders, as a construction company that's part of this broader industry? Then the next piece in our analysis is that in a white supremacist, capitalist, and patriarchal society, violence is culture and it is normalized. And it happens to all of us from the moment we're born on through the rest of our lives. Are these things normalized in how we look at the world? And so understanding this is crucial, because then we're able to identify how that shows up in ourselves, and then also how that can show up in the workplace, and then be able to create structures and values that can stand in the face of that and prevent that from continuing happening in areas that we can control. And then the third piece for us in this analysis is that access to land, social inequity, and climate change and systems of power are deeply interconnected. And these systems are at the macro, big picture level, and they're interpersonal, and they show up all the time and everywhere. And they influence which solutions can get fueled and which solutions do not, which narratives rise to the top, which narratives get pushed to the margins. And so, the big question is, where does the construction industry sit within this context? Obviously, folks like Yestomar, ourselves, New Frameworks, a lot of the folks that are probably on this call have an understanding and an acknowledgement of this, and have practices in place to address some of these issues or all of these issues. But our principal point is that this is a constant process, and it's something that we have to consistently interrogate, because as the conditions of our lives and our built environment change, and new things come up, we still have to be vigilant to really get to the root cause and the root systems of power that are at play. And so I just put some infographics up here, which might be well understood for everyone who's on the call, but it's worth some time to go over. And it's a little ironic as a personal note, like I was in the agricultural sector, and now I'm in the construction sector. And if you add those two together, the conventional side of those two sectors are like the worst when it comes to resource use and extraction, and CO2 and CO2e emissions, outside of obviously the fossil fuel industry. And so we can see here, US energy consumption by sector. The construction industry and our buildings that we produce, we're talking about essentially half of the energy consumed in this society. And then, you go on over to CO2 emissions, and this is an older infographic. but the visual still stands, and I think that number is actually higher for building operations and materials and construction than it was just a few years ago. And so, you know, this really can't be underscored because the construction industry has been such a polluter to the planet, and also has the potential to really drive some really awesome solutions that at scale and replicable can really make wide impact. So, you know, moving from the bad to the good here, and, you know, we're sort of just like glossing over things and giving a broad sort of 15, 20,000 foot view just for the sake of moving through it, and just sort of stimulating food for thought. By no stretch of the imagination are we like experts. We're, you know, just concerned humans that are in this context and think about these things, and wanted to offer this and had the platform to really share. And so we have much to learn and much to understand. And so I just wanted to like sort of put the nod to that. You know, I don't want anyone to think that, you know, we're thinking we're like the bee's knees or experts here by any stretch of the imagination. And so, yeah, so building up the good, moving the needle. And this idea of moving the needle is pretty common in sort of organizing social justice circles, which is this idea of how do we move the needle from the right, which is the destruction of life and people and planet, towards something that gets us closer to the center, left of center, that's more harmonious with nature, that moves us closer to valuing people in their differences, and finding a way forward together, because we all share this rock that's moving through space, right? And so, as we alluded to, you know, the frameworks that we wanted to offer was this idea of this just transition framework and applying it to the construction natural building context, or green building context, if you will. And then the other piece of the framework is social transformation within worker-owned co-ops, right? Because if we're thinking about degrees of control, degrees of separation, we're highly influenced by broad systems of power, but we don't have the same ability on an organized level to influence those same systems of power. And so the question then becomes, how do we construct essentially like localities of control? And usually those are the communities we live in, the people we work with, and in our case, worker-owned co-op. And making these alliances, these connections to other community groups within our network. Now, building up the good doesn't mean that we can't interrogate and criticize in a loving way, in an appreciative way, of solutions that are getting put forth, right? Of net zero, of natural building, of green building, right? It's to understand that critique and criticism is a good thing. It becomes a bad thing if the intention is not to build us up, but to break us down, right? And so I just want to say that as we about to step into this next piece, just to sort of lay that framework, because we're very critical of ourselves, and thus we're a part of this broader net zero natural building community. And so, you know, we want to air some things out. So I love the Endeavor Center. Chris Magwood, I've read all his stuff. And there was one presentation in this class that I'm in with Yestermorrow where he's talking about natural building and the case for natural building. And he goes through these slides and shows these different homes, mostly in Canada and in the Northeast. And he has price per square foot. And these are hempcrete homes, straw bale built homes, you know, cutting edge natural, high performance natural building construction methodology. You know, and so the price per square foot is $400 a square foot, and he's talking about it, it's affordable. $325 a square foot, $270 a square foot. And so, you know, I understand the COVID context, like we build homes, we design them, and it's very hard to figure out how to keep this square footage cost down pre-COVID, let alone during COVID. But the question has to be asked, who has access to this and why? Why do we see natural building or net zero condensed to certain parts of the country, particularly the Northeast, the West, and then scattered around, right? and I want to just throw that question out, not necessarily answer it from our perspective. I think, you know, maybe I'm insinuating some answers, but just throwing that out there. Where is it concentrated? You know, I think that we have solutions to these built environment problems, right? There are solutions out there to move away from foam in the assembly. We see straw built as a viable option for natural building or for construction more broadly. Deep energy retrofits, as they move across the mainstream sector, will then make certain materials more affordable than they are now. But the core of it in our perspective is who has access and why, who doesn't have access? How do we alleviate this issue? Because the reality is, if these technologies and methodologies are reserved for a particular class of people, the purported goals of widespread addressal of climate change will never happen. Because the masses of people who live in code minimum houses, highly inefficient homes, homes with very toxic materials will proliferate unaffected by said movement. And so it's really just to push the boundaries to think about how do we address these issues. It's not to say that builders have to reduce our wages, because it's very hard to maintain a living wage as a builder as it is, but it's to say, hey, how do we think about addressing some of these issues through partnerships with nonprofits, partnership with local organizations, thinking about how do we incentivize policy changes at our state or local levels. It really takes these sort of broad phases of engagement to address these issues. And we don't certainly have the answers or all the answers, but we certainly do have a way of thinking about how to address some of these problems, because we've had experiences that have led to successful outcomes addressing some of these issues. And so the last little question here is, can we become builders of the society we want to see? There's this phrase in Spanish about farmers that says, cuando el campesino ve, hace fe, which means what the farmer sees, the farmer believes. And that's sort of applicable across the building sector too. How many of us have built a certain way, new things come in, and we're sort of not really into the changes. But when we see builders that we respect or that we know adopt these new changes, we can then begin to see, okay, how do we fold these into our fold? And so, for us, the protagonism is how to become builders of the society we want to see, as opposed to builders of the society that we live in today, knowing that the society we live in today has all these issues that are eroding our ability to actually even have a society in the future.
Blain, this might be a good time, a good transition for one of the questions that came in from Colin. He asked, what are some of your ideas about how you can affect change on a greater scale? Which I think, if I'm right, is the next slide you're going to be jumping into.
Yeah. I mean, yes. It talks a little about that from our personal experience as a co-op. But the thing I would say is that what we understand about social movements and broad-based change in society over the last 100+ years is that the answer is by organized peoples, right? Is that through social organization is how you see broad change take place. And I can't underscore how challenging it is to comprehend as a builder to participate in broad organizations, especially during the peak building season. And so that's not what I'm saying for all the builders. Be like, oh, join nonprofit organizations or what have you. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that as builders in construction entities or organizations, we have an obligation, almost a responsibility, to think outside of the box on how can we as builders, our expertise, how can we contribute to this broader movement that is around us? Was there another question, or that was it?
There is another one that came in that is from John again. How long can the high price of innovative, sustainable building be justified as setting the bar or creating an example? How many innovative buildings can be built at $400 a square foot before the innovation needs to be focused on reducing the price to open access? That might be more of a question of food for thought than one that you could answer, but.
Yeah, that's definitely a good question for food for thought. You know, my short little response to that is that you hit the nail on the head. I think that there's never, since the energy crisis of the 70s, right? There has not been a shortage of models around, of homeowner built models, all the way up to civil society models of, at that time, the leading edge of construction. But, you know, I think the question then becomes, again, who's driving that and who's benefiting? Typically, who's driving it are those that can afford it, and who's benefiting are those that paid for it. And that is part of the problem. And so just some more food for thought. Yeah, so building up the good, the earthbound experiences. I'll pass it over to Domster for that.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so that was a great question that somebody had before about like, what are some practical examples? And we're definitely at a point now where we understand that like just our little co-op of 5 folks can never change the world or do anything that's too huge, you know. I mean, maybe, you know, yeah, who knows how our impact will really be, but we at least are going to do as much good as we can while we have the space that we do, even if it's just through small little things. So one critical aspect of our company is our focus on what we call solidarity brigades. And these are essentially just projects that we take on that are really mission centric and where we're providing oftentimes a heavily discounted labor rate to be able to put up, you know, beautiful and affordable infrastructure for farmers and community groups who are really in need. And so we try to squeeze a couple of them in each year. We used to do a lot more, but now we just don't have as much time as we would like. And I'm sure everybody can relate to that. But we still are, you know, it's still one of the cornerstones of our business and something that we really pride ourselves in doing. And so I just put a couple examples of some of the projects, solidarity brigades that we had done. There's an indigenous community in rural Alabama called Ikan Iafalija. It's their V's sound like A's, so it's, yeah, the pronunciation is a little difficult, but they are a group of Muskogee Creek's indigenous folks who are revitalizing their language. There's only like 25 Creek speakers left in the world, and so they're really passionate about making sure that the young folks in their community know the Creek language. And so we helped frame out the language school and also went back with the Timber Framers Guild and together did a workshop that constructed their ceremonial roundhouse, which was really beautiful. And we're not allowed to show pictures of that, fortunately or unfortunately, but it was a really beautiful and amazing experience. We went to Earthseed in North Carolina. We showed some pictures of that. That's a land collective of Black and brown folks. And we did a timber frame pavilion. We had done a treehouse for them, built a high tunnel for them, did a fence for them. With the Climate Justice Alliance, we've mentioned a few times, they're really plugged in with movement organizations all over the world. So after Hurricane Maria in 2017, we went in the winter, of 2018, in February, I believe, to Puerto Rico and St. Croix to help rebuild and restore several farms that had been devastated by the hurricane. We also, as I'd mentioned, recently purchased land. This was in tandem with the group, the BlackDirkFarm Collective. And the land is it's really a dream come true for all of us. And it's going to be used as sort of a shared space to kind of dream out loud, if you will. Earthbound plans to put up our workshop there. We desperately need a production timber framing workshop. The space will also be used for educational and cultural encounters and healing retreats. And then we also have an ultimate goal of putting up affordable housing on the land and being able to provide worker housing and farm worker housing. And then lastly, one kind of aspect of the business that we're really proud of is our educational components. So they're usually attached with the solidarity brigades, but we will host kind of carpentry or very, very basic timber frame workshop for Black and brown folks. That's a space that not as sure folks who have been to timber frame workshops or have been in the trades for a while, you just don't see as many folks of color. And so we're really trying to be able to provide that space, a comfortable space for folks to come and learn. And hopefully then want to join Earthbound is always the goal, but at least to have skills that they can go out with and start a career themselves. And then lastly, really prioritizing workshops for women and for queer folk. I think that's a double on top of folks feeling uncomfortable in those spaces. For women and queer folk, I think that, it's even more amplified. So again, just providing that space for folks to be able to learn. Like timber framing has changed my life. I find it to be one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done. And so sharing that experience with folks is really, really important for us.
This is a great moment for another question that came in. Ariel asked if you have any resources or advice to share with people of color working in building who don't have an immediate network of other people of color in the field.
Where are you at? Come work with Earthbound.
Good answer.
I think really, like these, especially the Timber Framers Guild and the workshops that are available, I think it's a really great opportunity to go to some of those spaces. Soulfire Farm up in New York, which is Black woman-led farm. They host a builders immersion, or at least they did pre-COVID. So I think that's a really, really great space to just like meet folks and get your feet wet a little bit. And in general, you'll find that like there aren't as many POC folks working in the building trades, or if they are, it's more at like the laborer level and they're kind of disconnected with the larger work. And so it's a process that we're all going through to like connect and get the word out more and just bring more folks into a career that has tons and tons of opportunity. There's so many jobs out there. I'm sure folks that own businesses and are working now know that there's such a boom right now in the industry. So it's a really, really great time to know how to swing a hammer.
Yeah, and the thing I would add to that is, yeah, no, that's really great. I spent in agriculture and then early years in construction. I mean, I could count on one hand, unless there's multiple parts to a finger. On on one hand, how many folks of color, let alone women or queer folks that I came across through my time in workshops and stuff like that. And yeah, I heard a lot of really offensive things said that just really should not be said by people. And so the thing I would just like relate is that have clarity as to what you're attending a workshop for. And that's almost to protect yourself. There were plenty of times I had to get to a point going to workshops. I was like, look, I'm not going there to make friends. I'm going there to learn information. And I don't need to really connect personally. I need to go learn this bit of information. And then bring that back to the folks that I'm in community with. That was in the early days. Now we're at a point where we have enough relationships with all types of folks where that's just not the perspective anymore. But I would say, you just have to be mindful about the fact that this information, in the case of timber framing or even natural building, like Black and brown folks have been doing this for a long time, and just don't lose sight of the ancestral relationship to these trades that we've all had a part in, just because the optics of it today is predominantly situated by one particular cultural group or one particular gender. And so just to air that out, I can't really underscore that. And also know that, like, at least from our experience, the Timber Framers Guild, like, we're always the only Black folks there, or even folks of color. But in that case, like, they're just an awesome group of people, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's the cultural and the race dynamics are there, of course. That's just a part of living in this society. But it's not to say that the people aren't great, fantastic people. It's just acknowledging that these dynamics are everywhere. And so, it takes a certain level of navigation to move through it with confidence and to feel comfortable. Okay, and then our last slide, looking ahead. And so, so this is a really lovely picture. I love the effect of sunlight at dusk, the effect on the mind and the spirit to see receding light, but you're receiving receding light. It's kind of a trip. And this is in Durham, North Carolina, at the farm where we've done a bunch of work for. So for us, we're looking to hire more and expand the co-op, really prioritizing women and queer folks. We have other women and queer folks who are part of our co-op. And so we're gonna die on that hill. We're committed to making that happen because folks made things happen for us, for me. And so we just need to keep that going. And take on more owners in coming years. As Dom mentioned, we really set things up for people to transition to ownership. But if someone does not want to step into ownership, that doesn't mean any hard feelings or that people aren't a part of the co-op. If anything, they're going to get more sleep at night and have a little bit less stress maybe. But so take on more owners in coming years. And then transition into an affordable housing model. I think many folks who are in the net zero natural building world are always thinking about affordability and are often caught in the crosshairs of thinking about affordability, but then having a business and a clientele that needs to pay your bills, right? And that's really the crux of it. And it's also to say, this affordability question is not, it's a problem we've inherited. Let me say that. It's not a problem we've created. Does that make sense? We've inherited because of the construction of the wage economy and our economy is that we have to have this conversation around affordability, right? We're talking about materials that come from the earth, outside of foam, of course. We're talking about clay and straw and water and derivatives of wood. These things humans don't make, but somehow they're very expensive. They don't have to be that way, but because they are, we inherit that problem. And then as conscious people, we want to think about how to make it accessible. And so for us, we call it, I'm a spiritual person, so this is not any sort of drag on Christianity by any means, but we call it the Holy Trinity. And so for us, it's 3 legs to this triangle: natural/clean materials, energy efficient, and then financially accessible to the working class. That's the matrix that we're trying to crack. We don't know how to crack it yet. We're in, several design phases for several projects, some homes, and it's just like an active, almost battle to try to figure out. And in the context of COVID, it's almost impossible. And so it's really thinking about, okay, where and how do you define affordability? And it's contextual. And so, we really want to move into this, and we're working with some of the organizations that we mentioned, the Seed Commons, the Climate Justice Alliance, and a few other foundations to figure out through some form of subsidy or what have you, how we can try to do this in the rural landscape. In the case of Maryland, affordable housing in rural areas means you're living in squalor. And that's just not right. And so we want to try to figure out how to do this in a rural area. It almost lends to a better context in an urban area just because of density and stuff. But, again, because our base are farmers and agrarian folks, we want to figure out how those folks who give so much to society and to the planet, how we can make sure that they're taken care of in a way that actually values their bodies and not exploits it or their pocketbook. And so, yeah, you know, we don't have any answers for that. It's just like our big vision of what the code we're trying to crack. And there's plenty of folks who we've talked to who are also trying to figure that out. And I know folks like New Frameworks, who we just love, are always trying to figure it out and come up with methods to help drill that down. And so we're often looking to the good old Northeast and the Vermont for the things that y'all are doing up that way. And of course to Yes Tomorrow. So yeah, so that's sort of our jam that we wanted to share with everyone this evening. And thanks, Rachel, for reaching out to us all back whenever.
Yeah, who knows how long it's been? It could be 4 months, it could be a year. Time's weird in COVID. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were game for doing this. It was really wonderful to really get the full picture of what you're doing and have so much good food for thought and for conversations with folks in my immediate vicinity. I just want to mention before I forget and before I finish up closing, but we're going to put a link in the chat for folks to support if you'd like. This is a free offering. It's always going to be free, but we really want to also use this as a way to make more connections between people and to help support work that we believe in, which is very much, we very much believe in what Earthbound Building is up to. And we're really excited to have them in the Yes Tomorrow network, part of the Yes Fam.
We're super excited.
Yeah, and we're hoping to get both Blain and Dom up in Vermont soon. I probably shouldn't have showed them the snow outside my window, but it's fine.
As long as it doesn't snow in June or July, it's possible.
I mean, it could happen, but I think you'll be fine. So next week, same time, we have Kenya Lazuli and Henry Harris, who will be talking about building a just transition through the climate crisis. So they'll dive a little bit more deeply into the idea of just transition. And I'm really excited for their talk too. Same time, same place, same link if you joined in on the Zoom webinar. And if you have any follow-up questions or want to connect, the link that we shared for supporting Earthbound Building, you can also find their contact information on there, and they're all over social media as well. So Blain and Dom, thank you again. Hopefully in a few years we can have you on to talk about one of your projects that is working within the Holy Trinity.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a better play on words at that time too.
All right. Well, until next time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye.